There's a specific kind of stuck point many people reach in their healing, one worth naming directly, because it's so common and so genuinely difficult to move through. The belief, often unconscious, that healing requires closure, and closure requires an apology, which means healing itself remains permanently, indefinitely blocked until something you cannot control, his willingness to genuinely acknowledge what he did, finally arrives. Today, we're going to trace exactly how to heal without that apology ever coming, because understanding that this is genuinely possible, not simply a consolation prize, but a genuine, complete path forward, matters enormously for anyone currently stuck exactly where this belief tends to leave people. Let's start with understanding why this stuck point develops in the first place, because addressing its root matters more than simply offering techniques without understanding what they're actually working against. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the structural, rather than simply reluctant nature of narcissistic incapacity for genuine accountability. This means the apology you're waiting for isn't simply delayed. In most cases, based on everything this entire series has established, it's genuinely, structurally unlikely to ever arrive in the form you actually need it to arrive in. This is difficult, painful information, and it's worth sitting with directly rather than softening, because genuine healing without an apology requires first, honestly accepting that the apology likely isn't coming, rather than continuing to hold healing hostage to a possibility that realistic assessment suggests won't materialize. Here's the first practical step worth understanding: separating validation from apology. Recognizing these as two genuinely different things that have likely become conflated in your own mind. Remember what we traced extensively throughout our conversation about why narcissists feel no remorse. The crucial distinction between his acknowledgement and your own accurate understanding of what happened. Somewhere along the way, many people begin unconsciously believing that his apology is the only source of validation available, the only way to confirm that what happened was genuinely real, genuinely wrong, genuinely worth the pain it caused. This belief, however understandable, isn't actually true. Validation doesn't require his agreement. It requires your own clear-eyed, accurate assessment of what happened, built through your own memory, your own perception, and, if helpful, through trusted others who witnessed enough to confirm your account. Here's the second practical step: understanding that his apology, even if it somehow eventually arrived, wouldn't actually provide what you're currently hoping it would. Remember everything we've traced throughout our conversation about the technique that produces apology-shaped words without producing comprehensive accountability. Even in the rare scenario where genuine words of apology eventually arrived, they typically wouldn't include the full pattern recognition, the genuine remorse, the sustained behavioral change that would actually resolve the deeper need underneath your desire for apology. This matters because it reveals something important. You're not actually waiting for specific words. You're waiting for a form of acknowledgement and repair that genuine apology, even if delivered, likely couldn't fully provide anyway, given everything we've established about the structural limitations underlying his psychology. Here's the third practical step, one worth understanding as genuinely difficult, but genuinely necessary: grieving the apology itself, as its own distinct loss separate from grieving the relationship. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about giving genuine space to difficult emotions rather than bypassing them in favor of premature acceptance. The absence of an apology represents a real, legitimate loss: the loss of the acknowledgement you deserved, the loss of the closure that genuine accountability might have provided, the loss of confirmation from the one person whose confirmation would have carried unique weight. This loss deserves to be grieved directly with its own space, rather than dismissed as something you should simply move past because you understand intellectually that it likely isn't coming. And this is where healing begins to become something more than simply waiting for the pain to disappear. Because once you accept that the apology may never come, you are forced to confront a much deeper question. If he never acknowledges what happened, who gets to decide that your experience was real? For a long time, the answer may have unconsciously been him. If he admitted it, then it was real. If he apologized, then it mattered. If he finally said, "I hurt you," then perhaps you could stop questioning yourself. But healing requires taking that authority back. You were there. You experienced what happened. You remember how you felt. You remember what was said. You remember the promises that were made and broken, the moments when you were confused, the times when you tried to communicate, and the moments when you realized that something inside the relationship had fundamentally changed. His refusal to acknowledge those things doesn't erase them. Silence doesn't rewrite history. Denial doesn't become truth simply because it's repeated confidently. And this is one of the hardest lessons for someone who has spent a long time being psychologically manipulated. You don't need the person who hurt you to become a reliable narrator of your own life. You can become that narrator yourself. This doesn't mean assuming that every memory is perfect or that every interpretation is automatically correct. Healing isn't about creating a story where you're right about everything and the other person is wrong about everything. It's about becoming honest enough to separate what you know from what you don't know. You may never know exactly why he behaved the way he did. You may never know what he was thinking during certain conversations. You may never understand why someone who claimed to love you could repeatedly behave in ways that caused so much pain. And that's okay. You don't need complete access to another person's mind to understand the impact of their behavior on your life. This is where many people become trapped. They spend months analyzing motives. Why did he do that? Did he ever love me? Was any of it real? Did he know he was hurting me? Does he regret it now? These questions can feel important because the mind believes that one perfect answer will finally make everything make sense. But sometimes the search for explanation becomes another form of attachment. You keep returning to the same person mentally because you're convinced the final answer is hidden somewhere inside their psychology. And eventually, healing requires asking a different question. Not, "Why did he do this?" but, "What do I need now?" That question brings you back to yourself. Maybe you need rest. Maybe you need distance. Maybe you need to rebuild friendships. Maybe you need to stop checking their social media. Maybe you need to write down what happened so that you stop mentally replaying the same conversations. Maybe you need to give yourself permission to feel angry without turning that anger into revenge. Maybe you need to accept that some questions will remain unanswered. And this is where grieving becomes extremely important, because sometimes people think healing means reaching a point where they no longer feel angry, sad, disappointed, or betrayed. That's not necessarily what healing looks like. Healing can mean that you remember what happened without needing to relive it. You can feel sadness without believing you need to go back. You can feel anger without allowing anger to control your decisions. You can remember the good moments without using them as evidence that you should return to the bad ones. You can acknowledge that you loved someone while also acknowledging that the relationship was harmful. Two truths can exist simultaneously. You can miss someone and still know that distance is necessary. You can forgive someone and still refuse access. You can wish they had been different and still accept that they weren't. And perhaps most importantly, you can wish you had received an apology while no longer waiting for one. That is a very different emotional position. You're not pretending you didn't deserve an apology. You absolutely may have deserved accountability. You're simply refusing to make another person's emotional limitations the condition for your recovery. And this is where self-forgiveness becomes another important part of healing, because after a relationship like this, people often spend enormous amounts of time blaming themselves. Why didn't I leave earlier? Why did I believe them? Why did I give another chance? Why did I ignore that warning sign? Why did I keep hoping? These questions can quietly become another form of punishment. But you made decisions with the information, emotional attachment, hope, and understanding you had at the time. You don't need to become the next person who punishes you. Instead, ask yourself what those experiences taught you. Maybe you learned that promises aren't enough. Maybe you learned that consistency matters more than intensity. Maybe you learned that someone being wounded doesn't give them permission to wound you. Maybe you learned that boundaries aren't cruelty. Maybe you learned that your intuition becomes quieter when you're constantly talking yourself out of what you already see. These lessons can become part of your future without becoming chains attached to your past. And there is something else you eventually need to release: the fantasy that the apology would somehow restore the version of you that existed before the relationship. It probably wouldn't. Even if tomorrow he appeared with the perfect words, acknowledged every detail, accepted responsibility, and finally admitted that you were right about what happened, you would still have to process everything that happened. The apology could validate you. It could matter. It could even bring genuine relief, but it wouldn't erase the experience. Your healing cannot therefore be built entirely around an event that may never happen. You have to build something that exists, whether he apologizes or not. That something is self-trust, and self-trust develops through small decisions. When you say you're going to maintain a boundary, maintain it. When you notice something feels wrong, investigate it instead of immediately dismissing yourself. When you need rest, allow yourself to rest. When someone repeatedly disrespects you, stop negotiating against your own well-being. When your instincts tell you that a situation isn't healthy, don't automatically require another person to validate the feeling before taking it seriously. Every time you honor yourself in a small way, you teach your nervous system something important. I am listening to myself now, and that may become more healing than any apology could have been, because eventually you stop waiting for him to tell you that what happened mattered. You know it mattered. You stop waiting for him to tell you that you deserved better. You know you deserved better. You stop waiting for him to explain why he hurt you. You realize that his explanation isn't required for you to choose peace. And once that happens, the absence of the apology can still hurt. But it no longer controls the direction of your life. And that's where the final stage of healing begins: learning how to build a future that doesn't require the past to be resolved before you are allowed to live it. And this is where healing reaches its deepest stage, because eventually the question stops being, "Why didn't I get the apology?" and becomes, "What kind of life am I going to build without it?" That shift sounds simple, but it changes everything. For a long time, the absence of an apology may have felt like an open door that could never quite close. Part of your attention remained turned toward the past, waiting for the conversation that never happened, the acknowledgement that never came, the accountability that always seemed just out of reach. Even when you were moving forward, some part of you remained emotionally stationed at the scene of the injury, hoping the person responsible would eventually return and say the thing that would finally make it all make sense. But eventually you begin to understand something that feels unfair at first and liberating later. Some wounds do not heal because the person who caused them comes back and repairs them. Some wounds heal because the person carrying them learns how to stop reopening them. This is an important distinction, because when you're waiting for an apology, you're often waiting for the past to change. Not literally, of course, but emotionally. You are waiting for something to happen now that would somehow transform what happened then. You're hoping that if he finally acknowledges the truth, the entire experience will feel different. And while acknowledgement can certainly bring relief, it cannot rewrite reality. It cannot give you back the years spent confused. It cannot erase the nights you spent questioning yourself. It cannot remove the moments when you abandoned your own instincts because you trusted someone else's version of events more than your own. Those things happened. And healing begins accelerating when you stop asking the past to become something other than what it was. This doesn't mean approving of it. It doesn't mean pretending it was okay. It means accepting that reality, however painful, is the only place healing can actually begin. You cannot heal from an imaginary version of your life. You can only heal from the real one. And this is where many people discover an unexpected truth. The apology they thought they needed was often carrying a much deeper request underneath it. Not, tell me you're sorry, but tell me I wasn't imagining it. Tell me my pain mattered. Tell me I wasn't too sensitive. Tell me I wasn't crazy. Tell me what happened was real. And those needs are completely understandable. But here's what becomes important to recognize. The person who repeatedly invalidated your reality was never the most reliable source from which to seek validation in the first place. If someone spent years minimizing your feelings, denying your experience, shifting blame, avoiding accountability, or rewriting history, why would their final opinion suddenly become the ultimate authority on what happened? Healing requires gradually transferring that authority back to yourself. You know what you lived through. You know how it affected you. You know what changed inside you. And while outside support can absolutely help, the most important voice eventually becomes your own. This is why journaling can be so powerful, not because it changes the past, because it preserves reality. When you write things down honestly, you stop relying on memory alone. You create a record of what you felt, what happened, what patterns existed, and what truths became visible over time. Many people who leave narcissistic relationships eventually read old journal entries and experience something surprising. They realize they knew much more than they thought they knew. The evidence was there. The intuition was there. The awareness was there. What was missing wasn't information. It was permission to trust themselves. And rebuilding that trust is one of the greatest forms of healing available, because self-trust affects every future relationship. It changes how quickly you recognize red flags. It changes how you respond to discomfort. It changes how willing you are to abandon yourself in order to keep someone else comfortable. It changes how much evidence you require before honoring your own instincts. And perhaps most importantly, it changes your relationship with uncertainty. One reason people crave apologies so intensely is because apologies seem like certainty. An apology would answer the questions. An apology would confirm the story. An apology would settle the debate. But life rarely gives certainty in the places where we want it most. Sometimes all you receive is enough information to make a decision, not enough information to explain everything, not enough information to understand every motive, just enough information to know what you need to do next. And surprisingly, that is often enough. You don't need to know whether he loved you exactly the way you hoped. You need to know whether the relationship was healthy. You don't need to know whether he regrets it now. You need to know what kind of future you want. You don't need to know whether he finally understands your pain. You need to know whether you're still carrying it in a way that prevents your own growth. Those questions are much more useful because they return your focus to the only life you can actually influence, your own. And this is where something beautiful begins happening. The energy that once went into waiting begins returning to you. The hours spent analyzing become hours spent living. The emotional bandwidth once consumed by the past becomes available for the future. The attention once focused on what he never gave you becomes available for what you can give yourself: peace, stability, friendship, purpose, creativity, connection, rest, joy. Not because the pain never happened, but because the pain is no longer the center of your identity. This is another common fear. People worry that if they stop focusing on what happened, they're somehow minimizing it. They're not. You don't honor your pain by living inside it forever. You honor it by learning from it. You honor it by allowing it to make you wiser instead of harder. You honor it by refusing to let it become the thing that defines the rest of your life. And eventually, something remarkable happens. You stop needing the apology because you've already given yourself what the apology was supposed to provide: validation, understanding, compassion, recognition, truth. You look back and think, yes, that hurt. Yes, I deserved better. Yes, there were things I should never have had to experience. And yes, I survived it. Not perfectly, not quickly, not without setbacks, but genuinely. And that realization carries a kind of peace that no apology can create. Because apologies come from other people, peace comes from within. An apology can be withheld, peace cannot. An apology depends on another person's choices. Peace depends on yours. An apology may never arrive. Peace can begin today. And perhaps that is the most important truth of all. The person who hurt you may never fully understand the damage they caused. They may never acknowledge it. They may never accept responsibility. They may never become the person you hoped they would be. But their limitations do not have to become your prison. Their inability to apologize does not have to become your inability to heal. Their refusal to face the truth does not require you to spend the rest of your life waiting beside it. Because healing was never meant to be something they gave you. Healing is something you reclaim, one decision, one boundary, one act of self-trust, one day at a time, until eventually you realize that the chapter you thought could never close has quietly become part of your story, rather than the whole story itself. And in that moment, you discover something that once felt impossible. You moved forward, not because you got the apology, but because you finally understood that your future was too valuable to keep postponing until someone else found the courage to give it.